The sun was merciless that day, blazing overhead like a torch meant to burn away any illusions of kindness. Heat shimmered across the dusty ground, curling the air until every villager squinted under its glare. That afternoon in the market square, life moved as it often did, children darting after tires they rolled with sticks, their joyous shrieks mingling with the chatter of women selling corn roasted over glowing charcoal. The smell of cassava, ground nuts, and smoke swirled together, blending with the rhythm of a place that seemed on the surface ordinary. Yet beneath it all, tension lived unspoken, for everyone had been watching for weeks as Baraka, the hard-faced patriarch, forced his pregnant daughter through backbreaking labor, and so it happened in the open, right where daily life unfolded. Amina, belly swollen with child, staggered in plain sight of her people, pushing a cart loaded with firewood piled higher than her shoulders. Her skin glistened with sweat, her hands trembling as they tried to keep a grip on the rough wooden handles. Each step looked heavier than the last, and still, no one moved to stop her. The villagers had long whispered pity behind their lips, but kept their feet rooted still. They were too afraid of Baraka's sharp tongue, his boiling pride that disguised cruelty as tradition. Then it happened. The crack, the shattering moment. Amina's body gave out. The strength drained from her legs, her arms slackened, and she collapsed in the heart of the square, as though cut down by invisible hands. The cart rattled violently before crashing against the stones. Wood spilled in every direction, bouncing and rolling with a thunderous clatter that startled the entire market. Mothers clapped hands against their chests. Children froze mid-chase, eyes wide. Even the sellers of roasted corn dropped their chatter to silence. It was as if the entire square itself gasped. Dust rose high, coating Amina's face like crumbs of earth claiming her. She lay there motionless, the bulge of her belly pulling cruel contrast against the weakness of her body slumped on bare ground. A fly danced and landed against her hand, and that small, pitiful image rippled through the onlookers like a blade carving guilt. Baraka was the first to break the circle, but not with the urgency of a father rushing to his child. No, he walked with the disdainful glare of a man insulted by inconvenience. He didn't lower himself. He didn't touch her. He only stood above Amina's crumbled form, his lips tightening before releasing words like stones smashing against glass. "Get up, girl," he barked, his tone sharp, each word laced with public scorn. "Stop pretending. Life has no pity for the lazy." The weight of his voice fell heavy. Murmurs began almost instantly, soft but sharp, like the hiss of wind weaving through grass. An old woman, Makina, her face lined with decades of watching injustice, leaned to her neighbor and whispered, "That's not work. That's punishment." Her words were passed, hushed but insistent from mouth to mouth, weaving itself into the air until the entire square felt it. Men crossed their arms, stiff with discomfort, their brows furrowed but none brave enough to step forward. Women exchanged looks, breathing heavy with outrage, yet they too were caged by fear. All watched as Baraka, blinded by pride, continued. "Are you not ashamed? Rise at once, Amina. Don't embarrass me before my people," he spat, carelessly concerned only with how he appeared, not with the daughter whose body cried out for mercy. It was a grotesque display. A young woman collapsed, carrying life, punished as though her agony were nothing but theater. Yet as Baraka threw his words like whips, the crowd grew stiller. The silence shifted. No longer simple onlooking, it was judgment, invisible at first, but growing heavier. Then, footsteps broke it. From beyond the dust, from the edge of the square, came the steady stride of Josiah, a widowed pastor, a man who had walked with grief's shadow after burying his wife, but earned the respect of the village by guiding others without demanding obedience. He was known not for thunderous speeches, but for quiet integrity, for being the kind of man who carried truth in action more than in words. His path through the watching crowd was unhurried, yet certain. When Josiah saw Amina's body crumpled against the sun-baked earth, he did not hesitate. He knelt, laying calloused hands beneath her head, brushing away strands of hair plastered with sweat to her temples. His eyes studied her pale face, lips dry, chest rising shallow and desperate. His voice rose, not loud, but a steady declaration that shamed every silence around him. "She needs water. She needs rest." It was said without plea, without doubt. Fact against fiction. Baraka stormed closer, face contorting in outrage. "Leave her, Josiah!" he thundered. "This girl is not ill. She wages drama. Laziness, that's all. Let her learn her place." His voice was louder now, desperate. Not just for authority, but to grab the ears of the people slipping from his grip. But Josiah stood, his hand firm on Amina's trembling shoulder. and faced Baraka with the full weight of his upright spine. He lifted his chin, eyes steady as stone, and said words that rang out like a hammer against metal. "A man who treats his daughter like this deserves no respect." The square trembled in silence. It wasn't yelling. It wasn't necessary. His calm rebuke carried further than rage ever could. And in that moment, something cracked in the walls of fear. Everyone knew Baraka's harshness, his unchecked pride. But no one, not once, had dared confront him in the open. Josiah's voice gave life to every whispered doubt, every hidden shame. His words filled the silence like dry thunder, igniting thought, igniting courage. Baraka froze, rage boiling behind his eyes, yet his mouth faltered. He had no instant reply, no heavy hand to silence the truth. The people's glances shifted, no longer locked in intimidated obedience, but in questioning, in disapproval. Josiah bent once more, easing Amina against his arm. Her eyelids twitched, faint life flickering back into her gaze. And the first face she saw was not her father's cold glare but Josiah's eyes, firm, compassionate, without judgment. She did not speak. Her lips quivered. Then she leaned into him, surrendering just for once, finding solace she had never been given. A woman moved from the crowd, a cup of water trembling in her hands. She broke her own silence and held it out. Josiah received it, tilting it gently against Amina's lips, moistening her cracked mouth. Every small action was rebellion against cruelty, every gesture another dagger at Baraka's pride. The old silence of the village, the silence of complicity, was dissolving before their eyes. Josiah rose partly, his voice carrying now for all to hear. No life should ever be treated as a burden. A mother who carries a child carries tomorrow itself. If we cannot honor her, then we have lost our way. Truth spoken simply can wound harder than any sermon, and his words pierced hearts that had once pretended not to care. Baraka tried to recover, his voice strained in defiance. "She is my daughter. I decide what is best." But the weight had shifted. The once loyal silence was turning into murmurs against him. "That's not care. It's cruelty. How long will we let this go on?" The whispers, once harmless, became heavier than any scream, and they marched not in Josiah's defense, but against Baraka's throne of fear. Josiah then acted. Sliding his arm fully around Amina, he lifted her as though sacred, his strength steady where hers had given way. He carried her not like a burden, but like a vow made before heaven, walking out of the square step by step, and each step hammered the truth. She would no longer face cruelty alone. Every gaze followed, children holding their breath, neighbors heavy with awe, women whispering prayers. In that single act, Josiah had become protector, challenger, breaker of a cycle. Baraka stood planted like a tree struck by lightning, stiff and unmoving. He had faced his first public defeat, a defeat not of fists but of silence, of eyes turned cold, of words that carried heavier than blows ever could, and the silence of the village now pressed heavier upon him than even Josiah's words. The truth was, for the first time, the mask of authority he had worn was beginning to crack right before everyone's eyes. As Josiah walked away, holding Amina, the square seemed suspended between two worlds, the old own, ruled by fear of Baraka, and the new one, sparked by a single unexpected act of courage. And deep down, everyone knew nothing would ever be the same again. Josiah walked along the dusty streets with Amina leaning on his arm. Her body was still weak, but her eyes held a mix of shame and astonishment. Each step was followed by the ville's gaze. Some whispered, others simply watched in silence. A few turned up their noses, but no one dared to stop them. For many, Josiah's act felt like defiance. For others, it was the first spark of justice they'd seen in the face of Baraka's cruelty. The pastor's home sat at the edge of the village near an old flamboyant tree that cast shade over the dirty yard. It was a simple house made of mud and rusted zinc tiles. Josiah opened the wooden door. The hinges creaked and led Amina inside. The scent of old coffee mixed with aged wood lingered in the air. He pulled out a straw chair and motioned for her to sit. Amina hesitated. Her eyes brimmed with tears, but pride still held her upright. "My father won't allow this. He'll come after me." Josiah stepped closer, placed his hands on the table, and replied with the steady calm of someone who carried a conviction greater than fear. "When you give life, you don't need permission to save it. You need rest, demeanor, and here you'll have it." She lowered her gaze, unable to meet the eyes of the man who defended her. In that moment, the silence inside the house spoke louder than any words. The creak of the chair, as she finally sat down, sounded like the noise of surrender. For the first time in a long while, Amina was in a space where she didn't have to carry any burden. a place where she could simply exist without being whipped by commands or humiliation. Josiah heated water in a dented kettle and prepared a corn porridge. As he stirred the pot, his gaze occasionally drifted into the fire, as if remembering his own pain. He, too, knew what it meant to lose and to keep going. A widower, he had raised his 2 children alone, enduring the judgment of a community that found it strange for a man to cook, clean, and pray without a woman at his side. So when he looked at Amina, he didn't just see a pregnant young woman in pain. He saw a reflection of his own journey. Amina accepted the bowl with trembling hands. She took the first spoonful, and as the warm food slid down her throat, a sob escaped her lips. Tears fell quietly, mixing with the simple taste of the porridge. She wasn't just crying over the food. She cried for all the nights she had gone to sleep hungry, drained, without a single gesture of care from her father. Outside, however, the village wouldn't stay silent. Older neighbors gathered under a mango tree, whispering, a widowed pastor and a pregnant girl in his house. That's not right. Their words were laced with suspicion, as if Josiah's kindness had to be stained by doubt. Others, however, defended him. He did what no one else had the courage to do. Who else would have helped her? The comments spread from mouth to mouth, and in just a few hours, the entire village was talking about the unlikely refuge forming in that humble home, lying on a mat on the floor. Amina could hear the murmurs drifting in through the open window. Every judgmental word landed on her chest like a stone. She wanted to believe she was safe, but fear lingered. Fear of her father, fear of the village, fear of what came next. Seeing her tears, Josiah sat down beside her and spoke softly. Don't cry over what they say. The same ones who whisper today will be the ones who remember what you endured tomorrow. Truth always lasts longer than people's tongues. His words didn't erase her pain, but they planted a quiet hope in her heart. For the first time, someone spoke to her, not to point out her flaws, but to recognize her worth. Josiah's shelter was more than a house of mud. It was a place where her dignity was slowly beginning to be restored as night fell and the wind rustled. The flamboyant tree's leaves. Amina fell asleep, breathing heavily but in peace. And Josiah, seated in silence, watched her rest. There were no hidden intentions in his heart, only the quiet awareness that a single act of care could alter the course of an entire life. The unlikely refuge was just beginning, but it was already enough to challenge Baraka's cruelty and the poison of the village's whispers. The sun was already setting when the first sharp tongues began to stir. In the muddy corners, beneath the narrow porches of homes, on wooden benches outside the village's small shop, voices gathered in whispers that grew like wind before a storm. Did you hear? Baraka's daughter is sleeping at Josiah's house. A widowed pastor all alone now taking in a pregnant girl. The words flew like seeds scattered in the air, but they weren't seeds of life. They were seeds of suspicion. The older women, with their colorful scarves wrapped around their heads, were the first to murmur, eyes fixed in the direction of the pastor's home. For them, the image of a pregnant young woman sheltered by a widowed man sounded like scandal, even if there was no proof of disgrace. The mere fact was fuel enough for malice. One of them, known for repeating anything she heard without filter, muttered with a voice thick with innuendo. That's not care, that's temptation. Nothing good will come of it. But there were others who shook their heads in silence, unwilling to agree, even if they lacked the courage to stand against the current of gossip. They knew Josiah was a man of integrity, a man who had raised his children alone after his wife's death, without ever giving the village reason to doubt his character. Still, the poison of words was strong, and once spilled, it spread quickly, intoxicating even those who, in their hearts, knew the truth. Inside the humble house, Amina heard the echoes of whispers that drifted into the night. She didn't need to make out the words. The muffled tone was enough to know they were about her. She turned on the mat, hiding her face in her hands, her tears staining the worn cloth that served as her blanket. The fear didn't just come from her father. It now came from the community, which could be just as cruel as Baraka, though with different weapons, the tongue and judgment. Josiah sensed the weight of it all. Seeing the young woman's restlessness, he pulled up a chair and sat beside her, staying silent for a few moments as though waiting for the pain to spill out. Then he spoke gently. Don't listen to their mouths. Amina, those who speak today will fall silent tomorrow. And when they are silent, the truth will remain. I don't fear what they say. I know what I do, and I know before whom I do it. His words didn't carry the grandeur of a sermon, but the grounded calm of someone who had lived long enough to know that the wind doesn't shake a tree with deep roots. But Amina couldn't shake the shame. Tears rolled down her cheeks, and her voice came out in a whisper. I didn't want to be a scandal, Pastor. It feels like my whole life is just shame. First my father accuses me. Now the village condemns me. I can't stand being looked at like this, like I'm a curse. She spoke between sobs. and each word seemed to tear deeper into the wound she carried inside her. Josiah replied with quiet strength, "You are not the shame, Amina. The shame belongs to those who choose to judge without knowing your pain. You carry life, and life is never a cause for condemnation. One day, this same village that whispers today will see the strength you carry, but until then, stand tall within yourself." His words didn't lift the weight completely, but they lit a small flame. Even so, the ville's venom continued to drip through the streets, leaving a trail that would inevitably reach Baraka's ears. Already wounded in his pride by the confrontation in the square, he would hear the whispers as fuel for his growing anger. To him, his daughter was no longer just a disgrace in his home. She had now become a public matter, one that threatened his standing among the other men in the community. That night, as Amina tried to rest under the clay roof, every malicious word circling the village became a shadow around Josiah's home. Inside there was silence, nourishment, and care. Outside, there was judgment, suspicion, and poison. The contrast was cruel between the quiet refuge of a just man and the malice of those who chose gossip over empathy. Josiah's shelter, meant to be only a place of rest, was already becoming a silent battleground. His fight would not be only against Barua, but also against the tongue of the community, a force that could cut just as deep as any whip. And Amina, torn between gratitude and fear, knew her journey was far from over, because the compassion of one man would not be enough to silence the voices of many. And so the ville's poison began to spread, preparing the ground for new conflicts, where not only Amina's honor would be tested, but Josiah's courage, too, in the face of a society that preferred to judge rather than extend a hand. The poison of gossip ran freely through the village, and it didn't take long to reach Baraka's ears. Sitting at the doorway of his house, sharpening a knife against a stone, he listened to the words carried in barely concealed murmurs. "Your daughter is staying at Josiah's place. The pastor treats her like she's his wife." Each phrase struck Baraka, not as truth, but as an affront to his authority. His wounded pride turned into rage, and every repeated word from the community became fuel for a fire already burning inside him. By late afternoon, Baraka stood up with resolve. His steps were heavy and the knife handle still rested in his hand, not brandished as a weapon, but as a reminder of his harshness. He crossed the square without greeting anyone. The men who saw him coming looked away. The women stopped whispering and pulled their children indoors. It was as if everyone sensed that something was about to explode. When Baraka reached Josiah's door, he didn't knock. He shoved the wooden door open, making the hinge creak loudly. Inside, Amina jumped up from the mat, startled, and Josiah rose calmly from his chair, his gaze alert and unwavering. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by Baraka's labored breathing. "Give me back my daughter," he roared, his voice full of fury. "She is my blood, and I won't allow her to bring shame to my name, living in the house of a widowed man. You have no right over her." Josiah stepped forward slowly, but without yielding an inch. His voice was steady, calm, but firm. "She's not a slave bar, but she's a mother, and a mother is not to be treated like a beast of burden. If she collapsed in the square, it's because you were killing her slowly with your cruelty. I won't let her return to the same prison of pain." The pastor's words echoed through the small house like a hammer striking iron. Bara narrowed his eyes, ready to respond, but he noticed something unexpected. Behind him, in the yard and down the surrounding streets, a small crowd had begun to gather. Men and women, drawn by the tension of the exchange, stood silently. Some crossed their arms, others simply observed, but everyone was listening. What had begun as a private confrontation was now becoming a public reckoning. Amina, her face pale, looked from one man to the other. Fear etched in her eyes. She wanted to run, but her legs trembled. She wanted to speak, but her voice was swallowed by the weight of her father's presence. It was Josiah who stepped forward again, not only to protect her, but to speak the truth aloud for all to hear. "Baraka," he said, "the whole village saw you let your daughter collapse on the ground. They saw your coldness, and now they see you demanding rights you never honored with care. A man doesn't earn respect by force, but by the love he gives." A murmur swept through the crowd. It was as though Josiah's courage gave voice to what many had long felt, but never dared say. Baraka's pride crumbled under the collective gaze. For the first time, the silence of the community no longer protected him. Now it weighed against him. Baraka, his face flushed with anger, shouted, "You don't understand. That girl brought shame to my house. She carries a child without a father. How am I supposed to walk through this village with my head held high?" But his words no longer held the power they once did. From within the crowd, a woman raised her voice. "The shame is not hers. The shame is yours for treating your daughter worse than an animal." The murmur grew louder, and Baraka realized he was alone. Josiah then spoke once more, his voice calm but cutting. Amina will stay here under my care, not out of rebellion, but because justice isn't begged for. It's lived. And if you still believe yourself a man of authority, then prove it by loving, not by crushing. The scene ended with Baraka talking a few steps back, choking on his own fury. He wouldn't admit defeat in words, but everyone present saw it clearly. For the first time, the man who had ruled through fear had been silenced before the eyes of the village. Amin trembling looked at Josiah and understood that something had shifted forever. What he offered her was no longer just shelter. It was a shield against the tyranny of her own father. The return of the cruel father had brought no reconciliation, only exposed a deep wound for all to see. From that day on, Baraka no longer carried just the weight of his pride. He also bore the distrusting gaze of an entire village that was beginning to see his true face. Sunday dawned differently in the village. The bell of the small clay chapel rang through the air as always, but there was an unspoken tension that everyone felt in their chest, though no one dared mention it aloud. After the confrontation between Josiah and Baraka, the community waited to see whether the pastor would say anything during the service. Some hoped he would remain silent, preserving a fragile peace. Others believed he would speak boldly from the pulpit. What was certain was that when the hour came, everyone was present, even those who rarely showed up. The chapel filled as it rarely had before. Amina, still weak, entered quietly and sat in the back row. She wore a simple cloth over her head, trying to hide from the curious glances, but her belly could not be hidden, and that made her the target of hushed whispers. Yet that day she no longer carried only fear. She carried a flicker of courage, knowing that beside her stood someone willing to defend her. Josiah stepped up to the pulpit with his usual calm expression, unhurried, without theatrics, but with the quiet strength of someone who carried more than just words. He opened the Bible, but didn't announce a passage right away. He remained silent for a few seconds, just long enough for the congregation to shift in their seats. Then, in a calm voice, he began, "There are pains you can't see, but they weigh more than stones, and there are people who carry these pains in silence, while no one dares to reach out a hand." The simple words echoed off the chapel's clay walls, striking each heart like a perfectly aimed arrow, eyes subtly turned toward. Even though the pastor never mentioned her name, everyone knew who he meant. Josiah continued, "Those who reject their own blood reject God himself. Those who turn away from a mother carrying life, turn away from the hope that he gives us." There was weight in those words, not from his tone, but from the truth they carried. Baraka was there, seated near the front, his face hard, fists clenched on his knees. He hadn't come out of devotion, but out of pride. He wanted to prove that he was unaffected, still respected. But when Josiah spoke those lines, Baraka's head dropped involuntarily, as if pressed down by the weight of his own conscience. The silence of the congregation was deafening. No one clapped, no one interrupted. But everyone understood the message. Amina in the back pew felt her eyes filled with tears. For the first time, her pain wasn't hidden. It wasn't a secret suffocated within her father's house. She hadn't been named, but she had been seen publicly before the village and before God. Tears streamed down her face, and in each drop was a measure of relief. She was no longer just the pregnant girl who had fainted in the square. She was the woman whose struggle had become a symbol of injustice that the village could no longer ignore. Josiah then lifted his hands and invited everyone to pray. He didn't ask them to pray for Amina, but for the mothers of the village, for the women who carried the weight of life in silence. And every voice that joined in prayer was like an invisible embrace, one that reached not only Amna but many others who silently carried similar stories. The atmosphere in the chapel changed. The breeze that came in through the cracks felt lighter, and some swore even the cicadas stopped singing for a moment. Baraka, unable to endure it, remained silent. His eyes avoided Josiah, and his once arrogant head now hung low. He hadn't been defeated, but he had been exposed. The entire village had seen it. The man who had long ruled through fear now stood before an invisible court, the court of collective conscience. When the service ended, the community left in silence, without the usual chatter that filled the chapel courtyard. Each person walked away deep in thought, a seed planted by Josiah's sermon taking root. Amina left last, avoiding any encounter with her father. But inside she carried a certainty. She was no longer alone. Her pain had been acknowledged, and that gave her a strength she had never known. That day, the first public prayer was not just a religious act. It was an act of justice. For the first time, the village began to see its own failure in staying silent in the face of cruelty. And Josiah, without naming names, had given voice to what everyone knew, but had chosen to ignore Dot. And in that heavy silence, fate began to shift irreversibly, preparing the way for even greater revelations to come. The weeks passed slowly after the service. and Amina remained under Josiah's shelter. The village, though it still murmured, was beginning to quiet down little by little in the face of the pastor's unshakable stance. But inside the clay house, Amina's silence was not only one of rest. It was a heavy silence, hiding within it a bitter truth she had never dared to reveal, the deepest wound in her soul, the one that made her believe she deserved her father's rejection. One night, as the wind whistled through the flamboyant leaves, Josiah found her sitting on the doorstep, staring into the dark sky. The moonlight outlined her tired face, and her eyes shimmered with tears. She was trying to hide. He approached quietly, respecting the intimacy of her sorrow. But as he sat beside her, he sensed that this was not an ordinary night. Amina took a deep breath, and her voice came out trembling, as if trying to break a knot lodged in her throat. "Pastor Josiah, I need to tell you something. Something I've never told anyone, because even God seemed to turn his face away when it happened." He looked at her with full attention, not with curiosity, but with compassion. And it was that quiet presence that gave her the strength to continue. "My father blames me for the pregnancy, as if I went looking for shame. He calls me a curse, a burden, a disgrace before the village. But the truth is, I didn't bring this on myself. I loved a man, Josiah. I truly loved him. He promised me marriage, promised to give me honor in front of everyone. But when he found out I was carrying a child, he turned his back and left. Said he couldn't take responsibility. And that's the day my father stopped seeing me as his daughter. Since then, to him, I'm just the reminder of a betrayal." Her words fell heavily on the hardened dirt of the porch. Josiah closed his eyes for a moment, as if honoring the pain he was hearing. Then he replied softly but firmly, "Amina, listen closely to what I'm about to say. Life is never guilt. Life is a seed of the future. The child you carry is not a curse. He is an answer. He will be the living reminder that even in the deepest injustice, God still plants hope." She wept like someone shedding a burden too long carried alone. Her tears soaked her hands, and Josiah extended his own, not to grab or intrude, but simply to be near, present, as if to say without words, "You are not alone." Amina's secret wasn't just about a rejected love. It was about the weight of a guilt that was never hers, but which she had borne in silence for months. In revealing it, she felt as if for the first time she could breathe without pain. For the first time, she wasn't being judged or accused. For the first time, someone had told her that the life in her womb was a reason for hope, not shame. The next morning, Amina seemed different. There were still traces of weariness in her eyes, but her posture had gained new strength. Josiah noticed the change. It wasn't just her body recovering. Her soul had begun to reclaim its dignity. Revealing the truth hadn't made her smaller. It had made her braver. The village still talked, of course, but Amina no longer walked with her head down. She moved slowly, still, fragile, but now with her head held high, and every time she passed someone, she remembered Josiah's words, "Life is never guilt." It was like a shield against cruel stares and venomous tongues. Josiah, in turn, felt a growing admiration for the young woman. It was not mere pity. It was respect for the quiet strength she showed, even after being crushed so many times by life. He said little, but in his heart, he carried the recognition that this woman, once called a burden, was in truth a symbol of resilience. And so that night of confessions brought more than a secret into the light. It revealed a new perspective, the opening of a door through which Amina could begin transforming her pain into strength. The truth, though harsh, had returned something the silence had stolen from her, dignity, and from that moment on, nothing would ever be the same. The days following Amina's confession felt like the slow blooming of a flower that had long been smothered in shadow. There were still tears, still the pain of abandonment and the burden she had carried alone. But something inside her had begun to rise. It was as if by sharing her secret with Josiah, she had finally found space to breathe again. The shame that once kept her eyes lowered before the village was giving way to a quiet flame of dignity. In Josiah's backyard, beneath the shade of the flamboyant tree, Amina began sewing little cloths for the baby. They weren't new fabrics, just scraps donated by the kinder women of the village. But in her hands, they became part of a leet. Every stitch was accompanied by a silent prayer, as if she was sewing not just fabric, but hope. And as she worked, the neighbors began to notice the change. The once withered and quiet young woman now moved with the steady hands of a mother, preparing to welcome life. The village, which once saw her as a scandal, slowly began to look at her differently. There were still whispers, of course, but glances of respect began to emerge as well. A woman who rises after falling commands admiration, even from those who once looked down on her. Children started playing near Josiah's home, and some even offered to help Amina carry water. Her presence, once a source of distance, was beginning to draw people in. Josiah watched this transformation in silence. Seated on the porch, he saw Amina smile as she spoke to the children, saw the light in her eyes as she folded and carefully put away the baby clothes. He noticed a strength in her that even she didn't recognize. He said nothing beyond what was necessary, but inside a quiet affection was growing. Not just pastoral compassion, not just a protector's sense of duty. It was something deeper, a feeling he dared not name, but which showed itself in the care with which he watched over her and the child she was about to bring into the world. One afternoon, as she was washing clothes in the makeshift basin, a neighbor approached. It was Markina, the same woman who had whispered in the square on the day Amina fainted. With hesitant steps, she said, "Amina, you're stronger than you think. The whole village saw what you went through, and still you're standing. That's not a small thing." Amina smiled humbly, wiping the sweat from her face with her forearm. "I don't know if I'm strong, Markina. I just know I have to keep going. If I stop, my baby stops too." That simple response struck Markina deeply. She left repeating the words to herself. She's not a shame, she's an example. And that phrase began to echo from house to house, slowly changing the tone of the conversations. What once was venom was starting to turn into recognition within herself. Amina felt the change till she no longer cried every night. She no longer hid behind shame. When she thought of her father, there was still pain, but not the same burden of guilt. And when she thought of the man who had abandoned her, she no longer felt only wounded. She felt a growing certainty that her story wouldn't end in that rejection. She was learning day by day that she could stand without needing others' approval. In a quiet conversation by the fire, Josiah told her strength isn't in never falling. "Amina, it's in standing up even when everyone's betting on your failure. What you're doing now, preparing every little detail for this child, is proof that hope is greater than pain." She looked at him, moved, and replied, "Noon's ever told me that before. People always reminded me of what I lost, never of what I could still gain." That exchange, simple but sincere, marked her transformation, not just in the village's eyes, but in her own. The young woman once seen as a burden was now becoming a symbol of resistance. And even though she didn't know it, she was also transforming Josiah's heart, giving him a new reason to believe that life could still bloom after the greatest losses. And so through stitching, shy smiles, and words of courage, Amina was no longer just Baraka's humiliated daughter. She was becoming the mother who carried in her womb not just a child, but the rebirth of her own dignity. The weight of the past weeks had piled up like storm clouds over the village. Baraka, once feared, no longer walked the streets with the same arrogant stride. His presence still commanded respect in some, but cracks had formed in his authority. The memory of the confrontation in the square, the uneasy silence during the church service, and Amina's transformation were all slowly eroding his image in the eyes of the people. Yet he refused to accept defeat. Deep down, he believed he could reclaim his lost honor. And to do that, he planned to attack the one man who had dared to oppose him. Josiah. The opportunity came during the elders, gathering a traditional meeting held beneath the old mango tree in the center of the village. It was there that the most delicate matters were discussed, and where the elders' words served as a compass for collective decisions. On that day, men and women gathered in a circle, and Baraka, his voice thick with rage, took the floor. "You all saw what happened," he began, gesturing with his callous hands. "My daughter was taken into Josiah's house. A pregnant girl living under the roof of a widowed man. That is not right. It's a disgrace to me, to my family, and to our entire community. What kind of example are we setting for our sons and daughters? If we allow this, soon anyone will do whatever they please." His speech rang out strongly, but it didn't find the echo he expected. The circle remained silent. Some avoided eye contact. Others adjusted their seats, pretending distraction. It was as if everyone was waiting for the first brave voice to break the tension. And then, unexpectedly, someone stood up. It was Mama Ao, a neighbor known for her blunt honesty. An elder who had raised children and grandchildren nearly on her own. Her voice, raspy with age, came out steady. "Baraka, don't talk to us about honor. The disgrace wasn't Josiah's, it was yours. We all saw your daughter faint in the square like a beast of burden. We saw you turn your back while she lay there, and it was Josiah who lifted her. Don't speak of shame when the greatest shame is a father who forgets how to be one." Mama Ayo's words were like a flame cast into dry grass. A murmur rippled through the circle, some nodding quietly in agreement. Baraka, caught off guard, tried to lash out. "Shut your mouth, old woman. You don't know anything." But before his voice could fill the air, another stood up. It was Cato, one of the villagers' most respected farmers, a man of few words. "She's right," he said. "I was there in the square. I saw it with my own eyes. It wasn't yours who shamed your daughter. but it was you in front of us all." The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time, Baraka felt the weight of a community that no longer bowed to him. He searched the faces around him, hoping for a glance of support, but found none. The circle of elders, which had so often reinforced his dominance, now left him alone. It was as if the figure that had long been feared had finally been stripped bare. Amina, watching from a distance, felt her heart pounding. She didn't need to speak. The village was speaking for her. Every voice raised against her father was a balm to an old wound. For the first time, she wasn't the one bearing the blame. The truth was rising from the lips of others, and that gave her back something she thought she'd lost forever: the right to be heard. Josiah, present at the meeting, remained seated throughout the entire confrontation. He didn't need to stand or raise his voice. His quiet presence was proof that justice does not need haste to be real. The steady gaze he kept on Baraka reminded everyone who had performed the act that changed Amina's fate. When the meeting ended, Baraka left alone, his figure hunched, his steps heavy. There was no greater defeat than this, to be silenced not by an enemy but by his own people. The man who once walked the square with his chest puffed, now left as a shadow carrying not respect, but contempt. That day the entire village learned that the power of silence can be broken when someone decides to speak. And for Amina, it was the beginning of a new chapter. The turning of public opinion against her father was not only a moment of public justice. It was the recognition that her pain could no longer be ignored. The fear that had followed her for years was beginning to lose its grip, and in its place, something new was being born. The certainty that her life was no longer bound by Baraka's yoke. Night fell quietly over the village. But inside Josiah's house, that silence was soon broken by Amina's muffled groans. The time had come. The waves of pain that swept through her body were announcing that the child she had carried with such sacrifice and courage was ready to enter the world. Her body twisted, sweat poured from her forehead, and her hands gripped the thin sheet beneath her as if trying to draw strength from something beyond herself. Josiah, used to heavy responsibilities but not to this kind of moment, stayed close by her side. He knew he couldn't take the place of an experienced woman, but he also knew he would not let her go through this alone. He ran to the door and called for Mama Ao, the elder neighbor who had assisted in many births throughout the village. She arrived quickly, bringing with her clean cloths and the steady calm of someone who had seen life come into the world through both pain and poverty. While Mama Ao took over the delivery, Josiah remained beside Amina, holding her hand and offering her short but steady words. "Breathe, Amina. You're not alone. We're here." And through the pain, she squeezed his hand tightly, not just holding on for physical strength, but clinging to the silent promise of protection that Josiah had made since the day he lifted her from the ground in the village square. Outside, the entire village seemed to keep watch in silence. Women gathered in small groups, some whispering prayers, others simply waiting. Curious children tried to peek through cracks and openings only to be gently pulled away by the elders. There was a sense of shared expectation in there, as if the destiny of the entire community was suspended in that clay-walled room, waiting for a cry to break the night. The hours were long. Each contraction wrung a cry from Amina's throat that echoed off the walls, drawing tears even from some of the women listening outside. It was not only a cry of physical pain, but of all the humiliation, all the rejection, all the loneliness she had carried for so long. Each scream, each tear, each effort seemed to drive away the ghosts of the past. Mama Ale with firm hands and calm wisdom guided the process. "Courage, my child, courage. It's close now." Josiah didn't let go of her hand for a second. In his eyes, there was something even he didn't yet fully understand. Not just the compassion of a pastor, but a deep connection forged in the fire of pain and resilience. As the cries intensified, he closed his eyes and whispered a simple prayer. Not for power, not for strength, but only that life might prevail over injustice. And then, in the stillness of the night's deepest hour, the miracle arrived. A newborn's strong cry rang out inside the house, piercing the clay walls and carrying across the village. It was as if that sound had shattered the darkness, bringing with it a wave of relief. Outside, the villagers let out deep breaths. Some women raised their hands to the sky in gratitude. The silence of anticipation was replaced by hushed sighs and even a few quiet smiles. Mama A wrapped the child in clean cloth and placed him gently into Amina's exhausted arms. Her eyes filled with tears, but not of shame this time. These were tears of victory. Looking into the face of her child, Amina felt that every moment of pain had been worth it. For the first time, she didn't see herself as a burden, but as a mother. The life she had carried through cruelty was now real, now crying, now living. Josiah, standing nearby, could no longer hold back his emotion. He remained silent, but his eyes welled up. What had taken place wasn't just the birth of a child. It was the birth of a new story. For Amina, for him, and for the village. The pastor, who once thought he lived only to protect others, now understood that he too was being changed. That he was being given the chance to witness and be part of something new. Something sacred. Outside, the news spread quickly. Amina's child was born. He's alive. He's strong. The same village that once whispered judgment now gathered around Josiah's home, waiting, watching, listening. The baby's cry had become a sign, a response, a testimony. Life always rises above injustice, and the cruel father, now isolated, heard the commotion from afar, sitting alone on the threshold of his home. He heard the cry of his grandson echo across the night, but for him there was no joy. What was relief for the village was condemnation for him. The cry that stirred hope in others became the sound of his own downfall, a painful reminder of his pride, his cruelty, and his failure to love. As the village celebrated, he remained alone, reaping the bitter fruit of the choices he had sown that night. The village came to understand something greater. A new life had been born, but not only the child. The courage of a young woman had also been reborn. A community's conscience had awakened, and the respect that had once been offered to fear was now being handed to dignity. The protected birth was not just a moment of delivery. It was the marking of a quiet but powerful victory over cruelty. The baby's first cry still echoed in the village's memory. When morning arrived, clear and fresh, carrying the feeling that something had changed forever. Children ran through the dusty streets shouting the news. Amina's baby is born. The women, smiling, carried water jars and baskets of food, offering what they could to the young mother. Even the men who had so often stayed silent in the face of injustice now spoke openly about the miracle they had witnessed. Life had triumphed over cruelty, and that was a reason for collective pride. Inside Josiah's house, peace reigned. Amina rested with the baby in her arms, her eyes half closed from exhaustion, but glowing with emotion. The child, wrapped in simple cloths, slept soundly as if the world around him had been created solely to protect him. Josiah sat quietly in a corner, watching. His heart was full. He needed no words to understand that this moment wasn't just hers. It was his too. It belonged to the entire village. Meanwhile, Baraka walked alone along the road that led to the fields. His steps were slow. His head, once held high in pride, now hung low. He knew he had lost not only his daughter, but the respect he had always held so dear. The community no longer bowed to his voice. The women looked at him with disdain, the men with cold distance. Even the children whispered on the corners that the cruel father was no more than a broken man. That isolation was his greatest punishment. He didn't need Toby flogged. He didn't need a trial. His own actions had judged and condemned him. In the village, Amina was now seen through different eyes. What had once seemed like shame had become a symbol. The younger women watched her with admiration, learning that even when everything seems lost, it is still possible to rise again. The older women saw in her the proof that life always rewards silent resistance. The young woman who had once been forced to work until she fainted was now honored as a mother. Not just any mother, but a mother who had faced rejection, abandonment, and the heavy burden of carrying hope alone. Josiah, on his part, never sought recognition. He didn't need titles or applause. His gesture had been natural, almost instinctive, to lift a fallen woman and protect her. But the village knew. They knew that without him, the story would have ended very differently. And so, though few said it aloud, many began to see Josiah not just as a pastor, but as a man whose faith lived in actions, not in sermons. The following nights were different. Around the fire, some of the elders began repeating a phrase that quickly spread. The man who lifted a fallen mother also lifted the dignity of the whole village. It was a new proverb born from real life, heavy with truth and memory. It became a lesson for the youth, a reminder for the elders, and a comfort for the women still suffering in silence. Amina, her baby at her breast, listened to those stories and felt the weight of transformation. She no longer had to hide. She walked through the village with steady steps, still tender from childbirth but full of a new confidence. When her eyes met those of others, she didn't look away. She smiled again, and that smile was not just the joy of a mother, but the strength of a woman who had overcome shame imposed by others. As for Baraka, all he had left was solitude. No more servants, no more applause, no more respect. Only a man who had lost his daughter for never learning how to love her. His punishment didn't come from others. It came from life itself, which in its quiet justice returns to each what they've sown. The cruel father, who had treated his daughter as a burden, ended up discredited and alone, while the daughter he humiliated was exalted by the community. And so the story found its ending not with riches, not with noisy revenge, but with moral justice. The young woman, once crushed by pain, became a symbol of courage. The pastor, who had only meant to protect, became a part of her life and her child's, not by force, but through constant presence. And the village, which had once been complicit in silence, learned that true honor is not measured by the strength of man, but by the quiet gestures of love and care. And even now, when the wind rustles the leaves of the flamboyant tree shading Josiah's home, the elders speak in hushed tones, as if preserving a sacred memory. That night, it wasn't just a child who was born. The dignity of her mother was born too, and with her, the heart of the whole village was reborn. If this story touched your heart, let us know where you're watching from. Leave a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to the channel. That really helps us keep bringing you real and emotional stories like this one. Thank you for being part of our